Hello, I'm Paul Murray, the founding director of the Centre for Catholic Studies here at Durham University. I'm delighted to welcome you to the launch of this very interesting new book by Gabrielle Thomas, For the Good of the Church, Women, Theology and Ecumenical Practice. Thank you for sharing in what I know is going to be a fascinating and enjoyable time. I'll start with 4 brief words about the plan for our event. First, we hope for it to have something of the light-hearted, celebratory nature of an in-person book launch. So if you spot any friends present and want to whisper a few words to them, please do feel free to do so using the chat function. It's also interesting to know where people are coming from, so perhaps share that in the chat as well. Second, this is something more relaxed and more inclusive than an academic seminar. Something in which we want each of you to feel able to be active participants. So when it comes to the plenary Q&A later, all should feel most warmly welcome to ask a question via the chat function. Third, to facilitate some of the ad hoc encounter and conversation that would happen at an in-person book launch. At one point, we'll move you into virtual breakout rooms. We find that people really enjoy that part of the process. But if it's the sort of thing that fills you with dread, then feel free just to turn your camera off and take some time out for a few minutes. Fourth, in terms of format, prior to the breakout session, I'm going to ask Gabby a few questions about the book as a way of opening up something of its story, its aims and significance. And then following the breakout session, I'll invite our 2 other speakers to offer their respective thoughts, Professor Tina Beatty and Canon Dr. Paula, who we are delighted to welcome amongst us. Then there'll be some time for plenary Q&A. We'll close the formal part of the proceedings promptly as advertised at 6:45 p.m. GMT. But should any of you wish to stay in the room to continue the conversation more informally with Gabby, Tina and I think Paula, then we'll keep the room open for a further 15 to 30 minutes. But without more ado, let me introduce to you the phenomenon that is the Reverend Dr. Gabby Thomas. Gabby is an ordained Anglican theologian and avid ecumenist who lectures in early Christian and Anglican studies at Yale Divinity School, New Haven, Connecticut. Before moving to the US, Gabby spent 2 years as a postdoctoral research associate here within the Centre for Catholic Studies on a project funded by the National Board of Catholic Women, and whilst also serving as a minor canon in Durham Cathedral. During this time, we came to recognize what a genuinely two-handed theological player Gabby is, with recognized forehand expertise in early Christian theological writings, and with an enviable, strong backhand in contemporary ecclesial and ecumenical matters. An integrating thread throughout Gabby's work is the concern to bring academy and church into conversation in relation to contemporary pastoral concerns that lie at the intersection of historical theology, theological anthropology, and ecclesial practice. Gabby's other books include The Image of God in the Theology of Gregory of Nazianzus, CUP 2019, and a co-edited collection on women and ordination in the Orthodox Church, with Whips and Stock 2020. Last year, Gabby was appointed to the Anglican Oriental Orthodox International Commission, and alongside her academic essays, she's also written for the popular Christian press. As we'll learn more about this evening, Gabby is committed to Christian unity, to naming injustices in the church, and to mentoring those involved in ministries of varying kinds. And as we'll also enjoy learning more about this evening, whilst Gabby takes her faith, research, teaching, and priestly vocation very seriously, she does not take herself too seriously. For all the depth, there is an infectious energy and lightness of being about her. I know we're all in for a most enjoyable time together. Gabby, it's really great to have this opportunity to celebrate and explore the significant new book deriving from your work here in Durham. So let's begin to take the lid off with a few opening questions. Now, I think people will be interested to hear something of the story of how the book emerged and what it seeks to do.
First of all, I just have to say hello to all of the wonderful people that I want to start whispering at in the chat. It's fantastic to see all of your faces. So as well as bringing women's voices to the fore, what I'm aiming to do through this book is to foster Christian unity, as you said, and ecumenical imagination. Sometimes when we think of unity, we can envisage a church in which Christians try and agree on things. But the book engages with receptive ecumenism. And simply put, that asks, what do we need to learn from another faith tradition to help us address some of the difficulties in our own? And a fun way that I like to describe this is if you imagine a very British afternoon tea. If you're hosting an afternoon tea, you're going to bring all your best plates onto the table. We'll have very nice matching china, some very carefully made sandwiches cut into little triangles. Everything's usually matching. If you've got silverware, this is the time to bring it out. But as we all know, we keep, well, at least I do, we have chip plates at the back of the cupboard. And often it can be a little bit like this when churches come together ecumenically. We like to bring the best of ourselves and say what we do well, what's working brilliantly about our church, how we might like to share with you how to do church properly. But actually, the reality is we've all got chip plates lurking in the back of our church cupboards. And what receptive ecumenism does is that it encourages us to be real about the sins and the wounds in our tradition, and to bring the chip cups onto the table as well as the nice plates, and to ask for help from others how we might go about mending the broken pieces. And Paul, you've mentioned that the National Board of Catholic Women funded the position. Well, these are a rather incredible group of Catholic women who were inspired by the possibilities of receptive ecumenism. And they used a legacy left to them to fund a position for someone to develop research which explores women's experiences of working in churches in England using receptive ecumenism. And that someone was me. And that meant that I spent 2 very happy years with the Centre for Catholic Studies in Durham.
Thanks very much, Gabby. Perhaps to follow that, you could also talk us through the story of the cover image and what that tells us about the work of the book.
Sure. So if I can share my screen here. Yeah, that's worked. So this picture is a beautiful, vibrant picture painted by the Reverend Ali Barrett. And she painted this originally for the cover of the book. And for anyone who's actually seen the cover, you'll notice that the book is actually, and I'll just hold it up here, an ink drawing, which is the precursor to that particular portrait. And the reason that I landed on the ink drawing rather than the portrait itself was because I wanted to emphasize that this is a work in progress. So we have a long way to go before women are taken fully seriously in matters of the church and academic theology. But also there's a point as well about what I'm trying to do with receptive ecumenism through this book. And it's something that I'm offering that's meant to be dynamic and not a definitive model. So what I'm doing is offering different ways of thinking with it rather than aiming to provide it one singular method and way forward. And so there was something about the fact that this was the work in progress that Ali drew on the way to the portrait that I thought captured nicely what we were trying to do.
That's great. Now, in the course of that work in progress, what were some of the most significant and even surprising things that you learned in the course of pursuing the research?
So there were a number. I'll just write 2 and then hopefully you can go and buy the book and read the rest. So I think one of the things that we all found fascinating during the course of the focus groups was that women who talked about their experiences and some of the difficulties and challenges and wounds and sins that they identified as working as women in their tradition. We had women who talked about being single, who were mothers, women of colour who'd experienced an incredible amount of racial abuse, and women who'd experienced sexual harassment. And what was fascinating to all of us was that these challenges were across the board. And so one might expect that the women who are in churches such as the Baptist Church, which has been ordaining women for years now, and the Anglican Church, that our experience was better or different, or that we were talking about something a lot more positive. But actually the reality was that those challenges weren't denominationally specific in any way. And I think that we all found that really interesting. And the second, and this isn't rocket science, but given the amount of stereotypes around, I feel like I want to emphasize it. Women don't all think alike. So often I'll hear, whether it's in businesses or the church, oh, let's bring women in because they're more pastoral. Oh, women are collaborative, so let's have a bunch of women in because that'll help. But I couldn't draw that conclusion on the basis of the research. Not that women didn't identify at all pastorally or as being collaborative, but there was no one unified overall outcome where we all said, yes, all women are like this, and we all think this, we all agree on this. Actually, the women were expressing lots of different opinions about what it meant to be a woman, what they thought their gifts were, what they were bringing to the table. And so I think probably the most interesting thing that I think it does is it really banishes some of the stereotypes that we have floating around in church.
Thanks very much, Gabby. That's fascinating. I'm sure more of this will be teased out in the chats and presentations later. Just switching gear a little, I've already alluded to your dual-handed range as an academically situated and ecclesially rooted theologian, and the way in which that's held together for you with creative integrity. So perhaps it would be interesting if you could say a little more about how you understand your role and vocation as a theologian in writing this particular book and this project.
Thanks. Yes, so while I think that women's voices and experiences are very important, and it was important to me to be able to document those and to bring them to the fore, as an academic theologian, I didn't want to stop there, but I wanted to think theologically with receptive ecumenism and begin to explore some of the potential solutions to the problems and sins and wounds that have been identified. And so part 2, which is really 2/3 of the book, goes on to explore the themes that arose through the conversations. And these were hospitality, vocation, leadership, and power. And I've intentionally drawn on a diverse range of theologians and brought them into the conversation. I think the chapter on power is my favourite, as I delved into Methodist theologies of power, which as an Anglican I found particularly helpful and interesting. And as someone who spends a lot of her time working on early Christian texts, I think to a certain extent, the way that I approach the task of theology has actually been formed by the early theologians that I'm reading a lot of the time. And I'm aiming to push against the fragmentation of the discipline by bringing the church and the academy into conversation with one another. Often these realms are a little bit too separate. So I'm aiming to push against that a little.
So whereas that might be strange in the contemporary, or a little unusual in the contemporary academy and in the eyes of some, of course, the kind of theologians you're working on in the early Christian writings, it's a no-brainer, as the youth would say today, that those artificial divides don't exist in the same way. The form of their writings are sermon and letter, and in relation to what arises. So it's actually a very it's very much in keeping, I guess, with what you are about in your forehand to also develop the backhand.
It is, and whilst I wouldn't necessarily try and compare myself to the greatness of Gregory of Nazianzus, who is the subject of the first book, I guess the fact that I am also ordained means that I do inhabit both spaces in a leadership capacity, means that's something that I very intentionally want to do.
And I guess that's something that's important to model, not simply for the church, but for the academy as well.
I believe so, Paul, yes.
Yeah. Returning to or looping back into your work with receptive ecumenism, which you've given us something of what the essence of that is about, and you've indicated that just as there's no one size fits all in relation to the views and perspectives of women, there's no one size fits all in relation to receptive ecumenism. So people might be interested, I think, to hear a little more about quite how you work with receptive ecumenism in this particular project and in this book, and the ways in which you take the story and approaches in the plural of receptive ecumenism forward in some ways.
Sure. So I have to say, we had a lot of fun in the focus groups, trying to identify a slightly more accessible way of talking about what we were doing than using receptive ecumenism, which is quite a technical term. We didn't at any stage come up with anything that really began to gather it together in the way that that phrase does. But what I would say is I'm very keen to hear from people who read the book. And if anyone does actually come up with another way of talking about this, then I would like to know. So one of the things that we did in the focus groups to simplify what is quite a technical way of thinking about ecumenism was I just got little boards up across the room, and we had people identifying these are the gifts just on sticky notes. So these are the gifts in our tradition. These are the wounds that I've experienced as a woman working in this tradition. This is where I see another tradition speaking helpfully. And so we actually break it down into very practical bite-sized chunks as we were sort of enabling each other to tell the stories and listening to one another. And I've included in the back of the book the different models of how you might do that. So if people want to go away and try this out, I've just included some different ways of working with the kinds of methods that I was using in the focus groups in that practical sense. But one of the other things that I was aiming to do is we haven't had a lot of work on scripture and receptive ecumenism. And so for those that might find this helpful to come at this sort of through what's the Bible saying about this kind of thing, where's the biblical witness to this, I drew together, it could be used as an Advent course, as a Lent course, that kind of thing, just a short series of studies that engage different passages in a way to help us really think about what this is doing. So that was one of the things. And then again, it doesn't sound like rocket science, but what we found was really interesting. When I actually had women in a room together, and you're saying to a group of people who've never heard about this before and haven't engaged with this kind of research before, because this is brand new, what we were doing. When I explained sort of this is what I want everyone to do, I found, and I definitely identify this myself, some people are always going to be the people who focus more on what's positive about their church. And some people are always going to find it easier to identify all of the difficulties and the challenges. And there are very few people who land sort of precisely in the middle, a wholly balanced approach of only thinking, being able to hold both of those together and not going one way or another. And I think it's worth bearing in mind as we go forward, particularly for things like the ecumenical dialogues at the formal level, that as much as we might want to engage with the theory of this, we are still people in a room, and people are going to have biases and preferences as to which they're more comfortable with thinking about. And so I think one of the things I identified was if we're going to carry on doing this, and I think we should, then there needs to be space to be able to acknowledge that kind of emphasis, so that it's not a bad thing that we lean one way or another. It's just how we are. And so it's just, I think, worth bringing that into the conversation to make then the conversations as productive as possible.
Yeah, to put people at their ease in their room, as it were, so that that can get going. That's very interesting. I'm sure we're going to return to this issue of the relevance of your project for things like the formal ecumenical dialogues and how that one might inform the other. On the clunkiness, the conceptual clunkiness of the phrase receptive ecumenism, in Archic, we followed the practice that we used elsewhere and frequently referred to it in a more descriptive way as ecclesial learning rather than receptive ecumenism or transformative ecclesial learning, which for people who want to be more descriptive than conceptual, that might work a bit better. But, I'd like now to introduce our first respondent. Born and raised in Lusaka, Zambia, Professor Tina Beatty is Professor Emerita of Catholic Studies at the University of Roehampton, where she continues as Director of the Catherine of Siena College. She is amongst the most prominent of UK Catholic theologians, with key works in Marian theology, gender, and sacramentality through the lens of psychoanalytic theory, and monographs focusing on Hans Urs von Balthasar and Thomas Aquinas. Tina has also published a novel, The Good Priest, with Matador 2019, and is a frequent contributor to the media. She works extensively with women's groups campaigning for change in the church. She is the founder of the Catholic Women Speak Network, a member of the executive committee of the Catholic Women's Council, and serves on the bioethics subcommittee of the National Board of Catholic Women. Tina, we're really so grateful to have you with us this evening.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you for asking me, Gabby. It's really great to be here, and I'm so glad because I may not have got round to reading the book as quickly as I did after publication, and I'm just really glad I did. It's given me so much food for thought afterwards. I love the structure of the sort of first part, looking really closely at the women's experiences and voices, and then the theological reflection on those issues afterwards. Sorry, I just have to get rid of my own face. It won't go. Anyway, I don't like looking at myself. And I love the sort of themes, leadership, power, vocations. I particularly found the section on power interesting, and it made me realize why Methodists are my favorite people to work with and go drinking with, but the most infuriating people to get anything done with. Having been on Methodist committees for many years, I suddenly realized it's because they have these wonderfully diffuse power structures which gives everyone a say and allows for lots of processes. So there was so much in this book that I really found thought-provoking, but I think what it also raised for me was the question about the huge difficulty of bridging the deep cultural gap about the way women are conditioned to relate with one another and with men, and the way men are conditioned to relate with one another and with women. And I don't want to generalize and I don't want to essentialize, but I think conditioning is important. And as I was reading it, I was thinking, by the very nature of the kind of societies we all live in, and things are changing, but it's still true, women have to navigate different worlds. Certainly, if we're in any professional or working world, we have to be able to be in male-dominated spaces because most spaces in professional worlds are male-dominated. And we're probably very familiar with being women among ourselves and using those spaces differently. You know, I was thinking of the years when I was at home with young children, and really I didn't have any male worlds that I had to enter into. And then moving into an academic career, I did have to learn ways of coping and dealing with those situations when one is often silenced. And I found myself thinking, do we need a receptive ecumenism project to teach men and women to talk to each other within our churches before we even, or as well as going out to one another ecumenically? And I guess I thought I might share a couple of anecdotes about that this made me think about. One was when I was a postgrad student and my husband was working away from home. Our 4 children were very young. I was rushing home. Well, actually, this was an undergraduate student because I was rushing home from lectures to cook fish fingers that were dripping all over my backpack, all over Immanuel Kant as I kind of caught the bus. And it was a frenetic time of life. And one of our male theologians was organizing a postgraduate conference and asked me if I would be willing to lay on the tea and biscuits. And I said, well, all right, yeah. He said, it'll look really good on your CV, you know, that you can show you're used to doing catering. And I was gobsmacked. Anyway, the other one is very recent, and it was, all my Facebook discussions are public except when I go off into our secret women's group. And there was a discussion going on about abortion where one woman said she'd had an abortion. It was a very vulnerable, delicate discussion. It wasn't at all antagonistic or aggressive, but a priest who was doing his best to join in the spirit of it still felt obliged to say how much compassion and forgiveness he had for women who'd had abortions, and then felt obliged to reiterate what the Catholic Church teaches on abortion and say he agreed with it. And it was just like the whole conversation stopped. And it continued in our women-only group, where questions of vulnerability and history and personal woundedness could be discussed without the sense of a male authority voice having to come in and remind us what church teaching says. And I found that painful because in both those situations, when I pointed out there was a problem, the men involved wanted me to understand how hurt and upset they felt by inadvertently causing offence. And, you know, I thought, gosh, this is so complicated, because when we do speak out, instead of meeting in a dialogue of equals, often we are expected to play the sort of mother figure who says, there, never mind, you didn't mean it, it'll be all right. So it seems to me this book raises huge questions about gendered dialogues, not idealizing women and not in any sense condemning men, but saying, how do we really create spaces where we can listen to one another within as well as between our traditions across the gender divide? And I think the receptive ecumenism model would work for that. Also, what it seems to be very close to is Pope Francis's wonderful vision of dialogue in his Amoris Laetitia, sections 130 to 136. It's intended for married couples, but I think it would work for any group where people are trying to dialogue across misunderstandings and sometimes hurt feelings. So I think that's probably about all I want to say now, and I'm sure we'll have more discussions later, but I really appreciate the opportunity to read and comment on this book. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Tina, for those stimulating and insightful reflections. The time's winged chariot steals across the heavens, etc. So I'm going to turn now to introduce our second respondent. Canon Dr. Paula Gooder is Canon Chancellor of St. Paul's Cathedral in London. Paula is a biblical theologian, writer, and sought-after speaker who works particularly on the New Testament. Her career has included substantial experience in ministerial formation at Ripon College, Cuddesdon, Oxford, and at the Queen's Foundation for Ecumenical Theological Education in Birmingham. Also included years spent travelling the UK and wider afield as an itinerant speaker, seeking to communicate the best of biblical scholarship in as accessible a way as possible, and time spent working for the Bible Society as their theologian in residence, and then for the Anglican Diocese of Birmingham as Director of Mission, Learning and Development. Paula's many books include Heaven with SPCK 2011, Body, also with SPCK 2016, Phoebe with Hodder in 2018, and Parables with Canterbury Press in 2020. Paula, we're really grateful to have you with us this evening.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you, Gabby, for inviting me to join in with this great conversation. It's a great honour and privilege to be able to be part of it. I've just got a few comments. There are 3 thank yous and a plea for something more. So my 3 thank yous in the first instance. As Gabby was talking earlier when she was describing the project, one of the things that she talked about was how this book is a meeting of 2 worlds, the church and the academy, and how in a way it is a conversation between the church and the academy. And that's my first thank you, is that as somebody who tries regularly to bridge the church and the academy, it's quite a lonely place to be. So it's a really nice thing to discover somebody else who is doing a similar kind of work in a very different kind of way. But a huge thank you for that work that you're doing, and that ability that you've got to encourage people into a conversation. And that for me is kind of the heart of this book, that what the receptive ecumenism method allows us to do is to draw people into the heart of an important conversation. And in this instance, it's a conversation between the church and the academy. And it made me wonder whether, in fact, adopting that method, but actually having a conversation between people of the church and the academy and those who bridge the two might be also a very interesting thing to do, to ask that question: what wounds, what gifts do we bring from people who are just scholars, from people who are just in the church, from people who try to join the two together? What can we learn from each other in that way? So that's my first thank you. My second thank you is for actually the model of using receptive ecumenism. Like Paul Murray, I have spent many years on ARCIC, and our last report used the receptive ecumenism method very deeply to underpin what we were trying to do. But at a bilateral conversation, it's a rather high-level use of receptive ecumenism. It looks very much theoretically at how we can conceive of various things. So to see the model used on the ground with actual conversations in our breakout room, Gabby talked about actual people, and I think in a way kind of that's kind of at the heart of what Gabby's doing. She's talking to real people talking about their actual experiences, and for me that was a really inspiring thing to see receptive ecumenism used on the ground in ordinary conversations with ordinary people, and getting a sense of how that can happen. So second thank you for an on-the-ground use of receptive ecumenism and a vision of how it can work practically in our conversations. And then a third very personal thank you about the recording of the experiences of women. As Tina noted in her response, being a woman in whichever church we find ourselves can be a complex experience, and finding the way to articulate that experience is quite a difficult thing to do. I found reading the book incredibly emotional, and it surprised me that I was so emotional about it. And part of why I was emotional is that I'm conscious that 80% of my experience as a woman, I lock in a cupboard for most of the time, because it's simply not acceptable to talk about that kind of experience. This has nothing to do with church, but one of the experiences I had when I was just starting out in university kind of really shapes the way I find that I inhabit the world as a woman. So early on in university, I had an unfortunate experience of sexual harassment, which I went to report to the powers that be at my college. And the response to it was, that's simply the price you have to pay if you want to come to this college. And I rather internalized that whole experience, and reading the book made me realize how much I'd internalized that to the, I simply have to put up with a whole load of experiences that have wounded me, because that's the price you have to pay if you want to be in this sphere. And so to hear the voices of so many other women in so many other contexts was profoundly moving and actually enormously helpful. And it's made me go back and do a lot of reflection on who I see myself as, how I articulate myself as a woman, and actually how I inhabit the space that I have as a woman in the church. And so for that, a heartfelt thank you. The other two, an important thank you, but this one, a real heartfelt thank you. And then a plea for more. This is in no way a criticism. But I was reading the contents page and I noticed that there was a chapter on vocation. And as a laywoman, I said to myself, I know what this chapter is going to be about. And I was right. And I thank you again to Gabby for the way in which you set up the conversation about vocation, because you are always really careful to make clear that actually you're talking about vocation to ordained ministry, that that's not the only way that you could talk. And you put all the caveats in that I would hope somebody would put in. But I would love to be able to encounter a chapter in a book like this that wasn't just about vocation to being ordained, and in fact explored what it meant to have a vocation for all sorts. And I don't just want to say we should have a chapter on lay vocation, but actually a chapter on vocation which leads in all sorts of different directions. And so this is my plea for more. because I think a conversation between our different denominations about vocations to be lay, to be ordained, to be all sorts of other things as well. But that kind of wider conversation about vocation could be a really interesting thing. Time and time again, in my experience in the church, people seem to think that I haven't got a vocation because I'm not ordained. And very slowly, I have to explain to them that I do have a vocation, and it's a vocation to be lay, and I have thought about it. It's not that I haven't noticed that I might have a vocation to be ordained. But I think actually a conversation with Catholic women, with Orthodox women, with women from the Baptist and the Methodist traditions, and many other traditions as well, about actually a receptive ecumenism understanding of vocation broadly would be a really interesting topic to do, and something that we could very profitably continue this work on into a next phase. So those are my 3 thank yous and a plea for more. And now I will stop.
Well, thank you, Paula, for those really helpful and perceptive thoughts. As we move into the next phase of things, the more informal, I just want to thank those who need to slope off now. To thank you so much for being with us this evening. Thanks to Tina, Paula, and Teresa for all you've done to help us celebrate this evening, this launch of Gabby's really important work. And thanks also to the National Board of Catholic Women for making the project possible.